So this is a story about Mudita. Normally we translate Mudita as sympathetic joy, but as I was looking for this story and just researching it generally, I came across a translation that I haven't seen before called altruistic joy. And that kind of struck me. It kind of went a bit deeper for me than sympathetic joy ever had. It's a sense of going out much more. That's what I thought anyway. So the story I found is a story of Visika. And I found it in a collection called The Great Disciples of the Buddha. And it stood out for me because it's a woman, and it said that she was one of the great benefactors of the Buddha. So if you're all sitting comfortably, as they say in the greatest storytelling tradition, I'll start. So our story begins in the city of Badia in a country called Anga in India over 2,500 years ago. So in this city lived a man called Dhananjaya and his wife Sumana Devi, who had a daughter called Visika. And all three, because of many good deeds they'd performed in past lives, were told had the benefit of much merit. And this was bearing fruit in their present lifetime. They lived quite a privileged life, and they were quite rich and powerful, along with having all this spiritual merit. And we'll hear that this merit was about to bear even more fruit later on. So once when Visika was just 7 years old, the Buddha arrived in the city of Badia, along with what we're told was a great retinue of monks. So maybe this 500 monks that Yanadara told us about a couple of nights ago. So when Visika's grandfather heard that the awakened one had arrived in the city, he sent for his beloved granddaughter. And even for a rich and powerful man, it was quite a privilege to have the Buddha visit. So when Visika arrived, he said, "Dear girl, this is a really happy day for us that the teacher has come to visit our city. So summon all your maidservants and go out and meet him." And of course, being a dutiful granddaughter, Visika did what she was told. She went out and met the Buddha and made him welcome. So meeting the Buddha, Visika paid homage to him as was customary, and he taught the Dharma to her. And the story says her 500 servants, and all became stream entrants, as did her grandfather and grandmother, and even all his slaves. So powerful was the Dharma directly heard from the mouth of the Buddha, that it can have such an immediate effect on so many people. I think this is hard for us to imagine when we're so remote from the direct teachings of the Buddha. But this is what we're told happened. Anyway, back to our story. At this time, the country of Anga belonged to the kingdom of Magadha. I think many of you have probably heard about this. It features a lot in the stories about the Buddha. And it was ruled over by a very devout king, Bimbisbara. And the nearby kingdom of Kosala, which we heard about the other night too, was ruled by King Pasenadi, who happened to be Bimbisbara's brother-in-law. So when Pasenadi heard there were such spiritually attained people living in the next kingdom, he has asked his brother-in-law and friend to send these people to Kosala so that his people would have the opportunity to witness a shining example of virtue. Of course, given the culture of ancient India, there was no question that this wouldn't happen. So Visika and all her family moved to the kingdom of Kosala. And here her grandfather and father established a fine city named Saketa near the capital of Savatthi, which I'm sure you're a bit more familiar with now, having heard about it again the other night. So Visika grew up in what we could say was a saintly family in a country where the Buddha was widely venerated, and his ordained monks and nuns were regularly invited to receive alms and come and preach the Dharma. So she had quite a nice life. In Savatthi at this time lived a very wealthy householder called Megara, who had a son named Punavadana. So when Punavadana reached manhood, which from our perspective would be still quite young, probably in his mid-teens, his parents thought it was time he was looking for a wife. As they would even in modern India, when a man reaches a certain age, particularly the son of a wealthy family. So Punavandana was adamant, though, about the kind of wife he wanted. Being brought up with all the privilege had made him maybe just a little arrogant. He wanted a girl who possessed the 5 beauties, no less. Beauty of flesh, beauty of hair, beauty of teeth, beauty of skin, and beauty of youth. So, of course, having indulged their son his whole life, his parents weren't going to stop now and employed a whole team of Brahmins. So these Brahmins are members of the highest caste in the Indian caste system. And the priests and teachers are taken from this caste, and they still are drawn from this caste. So they would be seen as maintaining the traditions. So they would be the ideal ones to be sent to explore the country and find a girl who could live up to the high standard set by little Lord Punavandana. So the team of Brahmins traveled to all the great towns and cities over quite a large distance. But they couldn't find a beauty who could match up to Punavandana's exacting standards. So on their return journey, probably feeling maybe a little despondent and maybe even more than a little apprehensive of what they might meet coming back without the prize bride fit for the son of this great family. Then they got close to Saketa and they saw Visika, who at that time was about 15 or 16. They were initially struck by her physical beauty, so they decided to engage her in conversation. And they were immediately impressed by her confidence and poise and her bearing, with which she answered their questions. So they went immediately to her father and they asked for his daughter as a wife for Punavandana. Dhananjaya agreed to the proposal, of course, but nobody consulted Visika. It was arranged and that was it. Soon after, Megara and his son and the whole family came to collect Visika. And when King Pasenadi heard this, he brought everybody together in his court and everybody was entertained lavishly. And goldsmiths set about making jewelry for the bride, which took many months. Dhananjaya gave his daughter many carts of silk, of gold and silver, and a huge herd of cattle. And when Visika was leaving, he gave her lots of advice. But the one thing he stressed, that she should always keep the virtue of generosity in high regard. So at this time in India, and probably everywhere else too, a wife had to live under the rules and duties. She shouldn't speak ill of her husband or parents-in-law. Before eating, she had to make sure that they were fed. And before going to bed at night, she was responsible for clearing up and locking up. And she had to be up first in the morning to set things up, and her parents-in-law and husband were to be regarded as divinities. So even though rich, a new wife in a household was little more than a servant. On the day Visika arrived in Savatthi, however, She was showered with gifts, but true to her father's advice to always be generous, she distributed the gifts among the people and almost treated them as her family. Such was her kindness to them. And this really endeared her to the people of the city, and they loved her from the first day she arrived. Now, Visika's father-in-law, Megara, was a staunch follower of a particular sect based around a group of naked aesthetics. So part of the naked aesthetics quest was that they would deny themselves worldly possessions, including going around naked. And you still see this in India today. They're called Naga sadhus. And because of this, his adherence to this group of naked aesthetics, he never invited the Buddha to his house, as would have been customary. And this was despite the fact that the Buddha often stayed at nearby monasteries. Shortly after the wedding, in order to gain merit, Megara invited a large group of these naked ascetics for alms, and he treated them with deep respect and laid on fine food to feed them. When he arrived, he called for Visika, saying, "Come, daughter-in-law, and pay respect and render homage to the Arahants." So the language we read describing the Buddha and his followers wasn't unique to them at the time, and anyone thought to have attained some level of spiritual attainment was called an Arahant. Visika was delighted to hear the word Arahant and rushed to the reception hall, expecting to see the Buddha, or like the Buddha's monks or senior monks anyway, because to her it meant one thing. From childhood, she'd been around Buddhist monks, and one thing only she thought about was the Buddha and his followers. To say the least, she was taken aback to see these naked aesthetics, which she found offensive to say. Can you imagine yourself coming in, composing yourself, and all ready to see the Buddha or some of his senior followers, and coming across this, a group of naked men standing in front of you? Maybe we could say she turned on her heels. We're told she chided her father-in-law and went to her room without entertaining the visitors. Something one didn't do in ancient India, probably in India today too. Entertaining visitors is very important. Our making offerings on the shrine is like part of that tradition. The naked ascetics, of course, took great offense and reproached their host and for having brought a female follower of Gautama into his household. They wanted Megara to throw her out immediately, but after a lot of effort, he managed to pacify them. But a number of days later, a Buddhist monk came calling for alms round on Megara. And Megara was sitting there eating a rich rice porridge with honey in it. And although Visika made every effort to have Megara notice this, he pretended not to see the monk. He just turned away. So Visika said to the monk, out of kindness to the monk, "Pass on, venerable sir. My father-in-law is eating stale food." Of course, this didn't go down too well with Megara. He was furious and wanted to throw her out of the house immediately. But because of Visika's kindness to everyone, she was well loved, and no one would carry out his orders. A while after this incident, Visika decided that she couldn't stay in this household any longer. She couldn't put up with this abuse, and not just abuse hurled at her, but at the Buddha's bhikkhus. So she told her husband and his family she was going back to her parents. But of course, Megara knew news of his treatment of the monk would get back to King Pasenadi, so he begged her for forgiveness. So reluctantly, Visika agreed to stay, only on condition that she was allowed to invite the Buddha and his monks to the house anytime she wanted. Again, reluctantly, Megara agreed, but on the advice of the naked ascetics, he wouldn't serve the Buddha or the monks personally. When the Buddha was invited and visited, just to be polite, Megara appeared just after the meal and then hid behind a curtain, listening to what the Buddha had to say. However, he wasn't counting on the power of the words of the Buddha. And on hearing all the Buddha had to say, Megara saw through his delusion and became a stream entrant. Visika invited the Buddha the next day, and her mother-in-law too became a stream entrant. From then on, the whole family became staunch supporters of the Buddha and his community of monks and nuns. So Visika is said to have given birth to 10 sons and 10 daughters and lived to be 120, but still remained young and strong. It's said she retained the appearance of a 16-year-old, the power of the Dharma life. So she worked tirelessly to look after her large family, but she also found time to feed the monks every day, to visit the monasteries, and ensure that none of the monks and nuns lacked food, clothing, shelter, anything they needed. So above all this, she found time to listen to the teachings of the Buddha again and again. And the Buddha is reported to have said of her, Visika stands foremost among my women disciples who serve as supporters of the order. So we're coming towards the climax of our story of Visika now. One day, having been in the hall listening to the Dharma, Visika left her valuable bridal jewelry. Do you remember this? It took months to make. It was obviously very lavish jewelry indeed. But anyway, so engaged by what the Buddha had to say on this day, she left this precious jewelry behind her in the hall after the talk. So anyway, Ananda noticed this and took it for safekeeping. But Visika took this lapse in mindfulness as an invitation to do something with this jewelry. And she resolved never to wear the jewelry again. So she decided and said she was going to sell it and use the money to give alms to the order. So despite all her efforts, apparently, she couldn't find one person in the whole of Savatthi who could afford to buy such precious jewelry. So Visika decided she would, in effect, buy it herself. She would sell other property and with the proceeds, build a large monastic establishment at the eastern gate of Savatthi. And it became known as the mansion of Megara's mother. And it's mentioned often in the introduction to many Buddhist sutras. And the Buddha is said to have often stayed there in the last 20 years or so of his life. There are many references to Visakha in the Pali Canon, mostly in commentaries, illustrating all kinds of important teachings, many of them relating to women and their lives. But one important one is related to the formulation of a number of rules of the Sangha. Pavra mentioned this last night. It's a section of the canon called the Vinaya. So there's a story about one of her nephews who decided to join the order of monks attached to the Buddha. But when he requested acceptance into the order in Savatthi, he was refused by the monks there, because the monks there agreed among themselves not to ordain novices during the rainy season. And Yanadara told us a lot about the rainy season. So this young man was told he would have to wait until the rains retreat was over. Of course, we all know what we're like when we're young. Well, I know what I was like. We can easily be distracted from courses of action. So by the time the rains retreat was over, Visika's nephew had decided he no longer wanted to be a member of the order. So when Visika heard of this, she was upset and disappointed. She put great store in the order. Maybe it was like an Irish mother. When I was growing up, a great thing was to have a priest in the family. Maybe it was something like that. So when the Buddha, she went to the Buddha and she said, the Dharma is timeless. There is no time when the Dharma can't be followed. Why should these monks exclude novices just because it's the rainy season? And the Buddha agreed and prescribed that ordination shouldn't be refused simply because of the time of year, simply because it was the rainy season. Visakha was also responsible for other rules that governed the life of the order. Once when the Buddha and his monks were guests of hers, she asked the Buddha to grant her 8 blessings or boons. And the Buddha replied to her that the Blessed One has gone beyond granting such things. But Visakha said that it wasn't selfish things she was looking for. So the Buddha let her mention what her wishes were. So she asked him to give gifts to the order in 8 ways. So she wanted the order to have robes for the rainy season, food for monks arriving, food for monks setting off on a journey, medicine for sick monks, food for sick monks, food for monks looking after the sick, regular distribution of rice gruel, and finally bathing robes for nuns so they could bathe in the river. So the Buddha then asked her the reason she made such specific requests, and she told him in some detail. So one being that during the rains, well, we heard from Yanadara that during the rainy season in India, it rains and it rains and it rains, and then it rains some more. So the monks were going around naked to preserve their robes and stop them rotting away. And they were being mistaken for these naked aesthetics. So Visakha thought that they should have robes for the rainy season. So newly arrived monks in Savatthi, who didn't know the town yet, had to walk around looking for alms, not knowing where to go, particularly having walked many, many miles. Again, Yanadara's story the other night, these monks had walked vast distances to get back to Savatthi to see the Buddha. So she wanted these monks to be sent to her first to be given food. So these are just a couple of the external reasons for Visakha making her 8 requests to the Buddha. But the Buddha was also interested in what her inner benefits she might expect. I think her answer really demonstrates how much Visakha had grasped the subtleties of the Dharma. And I think this is where we come to the nub of the story, the altruistic aspect of the story, the Mudita. So she said, Lord, bhikkhus who have spent the rains in different regions will come to Savatthi to meet the Blessed One. They will say that such and such a bhikkhu had died and ask what his destination is, as they usually do, where his rebirth is, what his rebirth is. We read this time and time again in the Pali Canon what someone's destination is after he's died. So Visakha continued. The Blessed One will tell them how a certain bhikkhu had gained stream entry or become a once returner or even an arahant. Visakha then said, I will go to these bhikkhus and ask if that bhikkhu had ever come to Savatthi. And I will know that he will surely have used a raincloth or had visitors' food. And when I remember this, I shall be glad, I shall be happy. I shall be full of altruistic joy for the gains made by this bhikkhu. I will be happy to hear of those gone beyond and rejoice in their good fortune. When my mind is happy like this, my body is tranquil. When my body is tranquil, I shall feel pleasure. All this will cause the development of spiritual powers and enlightenment factors. This I see as the benefit of asking those boons. Hearing this, the Buddha granted Visakha's request, and she lived as a model lay devotee and was bound for a final release from suffering because of her virtuous action and devotion to the Buddha and his Sangha. And she did indeed, beyond doubt, live happily ever after.